Hey everyone, Pastor George here with, Apologetics Wednesdays, and we're continuing our Heresy series, and now we're hitting the Middle Ages. And the Middle Ages is a time when Christianity became less, let me say this, more certain of what it believed, right? So we've had all these earlier heresies of what we call gatekeeping, right? Being like, no, we don't believe this, no, we don't believe that. And then we get things coming out of other places, other religions, right? Namely Islam, that has formed a bulwark against Christianity, both militaristically and theologically, right? So, even though it's not a Christian religion, today we're going to talk about Islam because I think it's important to see kind of where the overlap between some Christian heresies and Islamic belief falls in line. So, one of the interesting things is, as you know, we've been talking these few weeks, and every single one of these groups, when they were found to be heretical, they weren't usually killed. What usually happened is they were exiled. This isn't really at the stage of burning and all that type of stuff. That comes in the Middle Ages later. We're going to get into some of those groups in the next few weeks. At this point, though, many of the times if you were just found wrong, you were exiled out of the empire. And so what would happen is you would be in the Roman Empire, right? You would be saying, you know what, I don't believe that Jesus is really God. I think he was a man that became God, right? And or that he was God, but he doesn't have flesh, right? He's kind of like a ghost. He's not a man at all. And what would happen is they would go, you're wrong, you have to leave. And so they would kick them out of the empire, and where would they go? Well, they would go to the other surrounding tribes, groups, and cities, right? So, like, for instance, the Arians, who didn't believe that Jesus was born God, right, that he became God, went to other places, namely to the German tribes up in what is now Germany, which wasn't settled by the Roman Empire yet. And they converted them to Arian Christianity. So, like, we talk about the Visigoths sacking Rome, right? We usually think of like pagans sacking Rome, but it was actually a heretical Christian group that sacked Rome at the time. They eventually converted to like Orthodox Christianity, but they weren't at the time. Other groups and stuff like that would go off into the deserts of Arabia, and that's where they kind of run into the Arab tribes. We know that there were Christians in the Arab tribes. We know that there were Jews in the Arab tribes. We know that there were all sorts of things. Saudi Arabia, that region served as a very important trade route for spices. So the spices would come from India by sea, and they would be taken up by the Arabs up into what would be modern day Israel, where they would be traded to the Roman Empire, and the spices would get all over the Mediterranean. Right, it was the spice road, like the Silk Road, but with spice. And so there was an important trade route, and so you would have merchants of all different religions going through here, and so you'd get a lot of different beliefs. Right. Well, these were beliefs that were encountered by the man who would become known as the Prophet Muhammad. Now, as Christians, we obviously do not believe that Muhammad was a prophet, right? We believe that Jesus gives the final revelation. There's nothing else to be added here. And that scripture is done, right? But the Muslims think differently. They believe that Muhammad was in a cave when he encountered the angel Gabriel, and Gabriel gave him a lot of new info. And that's in the Quran, right? The stuff in the Quran is what Muslims believe is the literal words of God transmitted to Muhammad by the prophet Gabriel, right? Or not prophet, angel Gabriel. Now, the interesting thing about many of these stories is they have many, especially when it comes to Jesus, stories about Jesus that we do not have in the New Testament, but we do have it in other sources. So, for instance, the Quran talks about the child Jesus making clay pigeons and then breathing life into them, and then they become real pigeons, right? Well, we actually have that story from an earlier source, but it's from a Gnostic gospel. If you remember the Gnostics, right, they're the ones that believe that matter is evil, right, and that Jesus was God, and that we need to escape from the world, and that Jesus never really died on the cross because gods can't die, right? All these types of things. And so that's a story from a Gnostic gospel that's not in ours because the church said that's not what happened. We're not going to put that in to prove some theological point, right? And they would kick them out. And where would these people go? They would go into places like Arabia, and they would share their beliefs. And so it's pretty clear from the historical record that Muhammad encountered these people and ended up absorbing their beliefs. And it's very funny if you read Christians at the time, they're telling them this and they just believe at first that Islam is just another heresy of Christianity because they're seeing what they're saying about Jesus, right? Some important things to note between Muslims and Christians when it comes to who Jesus is. Muslims don't believe Jesus is the Son of God, right? They don't believe that he died on the cross. They think he was swapped with one of his disciples at the last second, the guy who was carrying the cross, or Joseph of Arimathea. Or Cyrene, sorry, Simon of Cyrene, and you know that's not what happened. Those were all beliefs that were taught by heretical Christians and somehow got into the minds of the Arabians. Well, not somehow. They went down there and told them this, and Muhammad observed them and put them into what he was saying was what was true. So it's really interesting. That's kind of this is a pretty big debating, contentious point between Christians and Muslims. And just like Christianity has some embarrassing stuff to deal with, like the apostles selling out Jesus, right? Not wanting to defend him, running away, Jesus being betrayed by Judas. Pretty embarrassing things for someone who claimed to be a prophet, right, or God himself, right? These are things that that are interesting to think about when you come to Christianity. There's also these embarrassing things in other religions, and in Islam, one of them is that Muhammad incorporated a lot of heretical and nonsensical teachings of other faiths into his own. So it's kind of interesting thing. All right, so that was Islam today. Not a heresy technically, another religion, but it absorbed a lot of the heresies we've been talking about. Next week, we're going to head into the medieval period, and that's where we're going to get into boring tier, where everyone just copy-paste stuff people previously did. As the book of Ecclesiastes says, there's nothing new under the sun. All right, everyone. Peace out. I will see you next week or tomorrow or whenever.